time, right? And that's exactly how you implement it.
So two things that I really appreciate that you bring up. Number one, habits. I think they're one of the most powerful influences of human behavior, and they're also something that we can change, right? Or we can create new habits. So I'll talk about that in just a second. But the other one is that this is a practice, right? There are days where I go out and I do really well objectively from what I think it means to be situationally aware. And then there's other days where I find myself being caught off guard by somebody who might have been closer to me in line than I thought, or any decision I make that I look back on and I'm like, you know what? That was an unnecessary risk to take. It worked out fine, but I won't take that again. So recognize that like it's a sliding scale. 100%, perfect perfection doesn't really exist. But give yourself the ability to bounce back and learn from those mistakes and incorporate them. But to go back to habits, if you are brand new to this and you're watching this as your first video, thank you for sticking all the way through. I know this could be a little bit much, but understand that it starts with really simple habit changes. Maybe the very first thing you start doing after watching this video is trying to count the number of exits in a location that you go into, or maybe it's you start looking at people's hands, right? Because basic threat ID begins with hands, eyes, and surroundings. So maybe the first thing you do is, we teach people to count wristwatches or jewelry because it teaches you to look in the right places. So
for clarity, that's not full-time life. That's an exercise.
Correct.
To get in the habit.
Yeah, exactly. So transitioning into a habit of looking at the hands begins with games, right? So pick one thing that this video talks about, or that you've learned from other people, because it is a community and there's other people with valuable insights.
So it sounds like you're trying to transition now. Before we do.
No,
okay.
Not at all.
Okay.
Yeah. But since he mentioned habits, don't feel like you have to do all this stuff right tomorrow. Pick one thing, focus on it, get comfortable at it, pick the next thing, and then the next thing you know, you've eaten the whale, as Shane
exactly.
points out.
Small incremental changes.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, too, kind of backing up right before that, we're not perfect. I don't claim to be perfect, nor will I ever.
He does.
And and there are times that I'll tell you that I might even be irresponsible in my risk acceptance. But what I will say is it is always a thought process of mine. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I want this and I'm accepting this risk. Yeah. And you know what? And if something happens to me, then it was, I could have possibly prevented it. And so at the end of the day, it's an individual responsibility and personal responsibility. As long as I just think it is a personal responsibility to somewhat take that into consideration, and especially for those who have family, loved ones, it is your responsibility to protect them.
Yep.
And if you carry around that particular lackadaisical attitude, I find that
unacceptable,
deplorable,
to
use a liberal terminology.
Well, and to that, from a situational awareness perspective, next we'll talk about proactive attitudes, and that quite literally means sitting around and deliberately thinking about it. And there's a lot of science that goes into the idea that if I've mentally rehearsed something before it happens, I'm more prepared to deal with it. So as I pull into a gas station that's poorly lit and I see a group of people that might get the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I mentally rehearse what would I do if these individuals started to walk up and separate around my vehicle. Therefore, my proactive attitude has put me in a position that I'm not having to develop that course of action in the moment when I have the stress and fear of consequence. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to stick with the plan that I have rehearsed. You need to have situational awareness that tells you when, oh, nope, it's now a good time to get back in the car and leave, or, hey, you know what? They're just genuinely looking for, help with, money for gas or something like that. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to social norms tell you that you don't need or that you should be willing to help everybody out. Sometimes you're not going to help them out because it's not the right thing to do from a risk acceptance perspective. But that proactive attitude is something that I find myself trying to incorporate pretty regularly, and really that just boils down to what would I do if.
Yeah, and that's what's funny. So a couple things. It blends into risk assessment, which that would be something we can talk on.
Yeah,
and we're actually hitting pretty heavily on here because it blends well
podcast.
Into it. Yeah. But then also, I'd say, I mentioned I'm a prepared lifestyle, as as part of the modern warrior thing. But that is a huge part in that typical, in that culture of the prepper. I mean, that's exactly what you do. Is you determine various potential threats, and you mitigate against them. Pandemics, I've got these things on hand. This, I've got these things. It's the same
If I live in
thing.
tornado alley,
Exactly.
hurricanes,
I
whatever.
have a tornado evac plan or a sheltering plan or whatever it is. It's the same. It's the same
Yep.
thing. Right?
Yep, that proactive attitude really puts you in, understand that you'll almost never be actually ahead of the bang, so to speak, because from an adversarial standpoint, they pick the time and place, right? I can't proactively shoot somebody that I know is going to be a threat, tomorrow or something like that. You call the police if someone threatens you.
Can't, though,
Yeah, I won't comment on that. But you can be very proactive with other natural disasters or going hiking, and so situational awareness applies across all 4 domains of the Modern Warrior Project.
But even going back to like personal security threats, where I would say, and you can't be proactive. I can get a bad vibe from someone, but I can't proactively
Engage them, yeah.
But having identified my actions can shave off seconds or even split seconds, which can make the difference between life and death,
100%.
success or failure.
Yep.
And that's the big deal. Is you don't have to react. You already have to. Now you have to act or enact what you've already considered.
So where this really comes into play, first I'll talk about the OODA Loop, and then I'll tie it back into the CSE change, which is really the core concept of CSE. But the OODA Loop says that you're going to observe, orient, decide, and act. Well, if I've done 3 of those 4 steps, maybe I have 2 courses of action for whatever this threat presents, but I'm not having to observe, orient, decide, and act in that moment, which makes it much more challenging.
So before we go too far into that, because they may have never heard this.
Okay, yeah.
So what does observe mean?
So the OODA Loop was developed or really kind of codified by Colonel Boyd, an Air Force pilot extraordinaire, who had a great career and has helped develop several aircraft, but he helped break down the way that we make kind of these time-critical, high-risk decisions. Observe is quite literally just, I am observing the environment, and that's the first opportunity I have to recognize that there might be, in this case, a threat, right? So orient means I am orienting either my physical body, I'm turning towards it, or I'm orienting my mental faculties, like I am pointing my mind at what I now recognize as a threat and starting to make a real assessment of it. Decide is pretty straightforward. I develop courses of action, I determine which one I think is the best, and I pick the one that I want to use, and then act is I carry that out, right? Now, where that tactical decision-making model kind of lacks is where the CSE chain picks up, and that from a threat risk assessment, prepper standpoint, you have 2 options, only 2. You can work to avoid that threat, or you can work to recover control from the situation if that threat has imposed its will upon you initially. So where the OODA Loop kind of helps us logically organize what goes on in the mind, the CSE chain tells us that knowledge and awareness leads to recognition, and from there I can recover or avoid, right? Obviously we will always want to avoid, but sometimes we don't have that opportunity. So the OODA Loop structures the way our mind works, and the CSE chain helps push us in the right direction. It says, hey, can I avoid this? If so, attempt to, and then if I no longer can, I come back up and I recognize that, and then I go into a recovery mindset, which is not something that we're really going to address here, but is covered in great depth in our fundamentals of recovery. Yeah. So then last, from a situational awareness perspective, is pre-conflict cues. And the word cue is chosen for a very deliberate reason. You'll hear other people talk about pre-conflict indicators. Well, an indicator just tells you the status of something, right? I can show you a bunch of indicators on a nuclear reactor and they will mean nothing to you, even if they're telling you the plant's about to melt down, because you don't have that context. Whereas a cue is a signal for action. So when I see a threat take a step beyond what I consider to be a safe, reactionary gap, I take action, right? So I am triggered to then move offline, or it's exactly right. So it's kind of the thing that tells me I need to do something. Now, it doesn't always mean recovery action. It doesn't mean that I draw a firearm. Maybe I see individuals kind of in a heated argument at some distance, and I recognize that this has nothing to do with me, but my family's in that restaurant, and I go, hey, you know what, guys? we're getting out of here right now. I'll come back and pay because I don't want to be here for when whatever happens. So pre-conflict cues are based entirely on good situational awareness because you cannot recognize that cue and therefore take the action that's necessary if you aren't aware of what's going on around you and how those things might change.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great point. And that kind of ties in, well, it doesn't, but before we segue out, I do want to hit on, we talked about earlier, our cultural norms. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know if we dug into it, but something I hear when I'm conducting CSE training quite a lot are, a lot of times the student might bring up a situation, hey, what would have this done, or this happened to me? And oftentimes, a lot of times it turns out okay, but the potential threat or the potential vulnerability was due to politeness on their part. I had a female student one time told me she was in a bar and the guy was super nice and they were having a good conversation. And he pulled out a picture of his car he'd just gotten. They were talking about some kind of a commonality, it might have been the audio system, and he kept pushing her to go out to see his car. And she was uncomfortable with it. Eventually she gave in. She went out, nothing happened. It was fortunate. But at the end of the day, something could have happened. She was fortunate that the guy didn't have those ill intentions. But at the end of the day, she ignored that inner voice saying, hey, I don't know him, I shouldn't go into a dark parking lot to his car with him. It would have taken one thing, just to throw her in the back of that car, right? And so it's really important to pay attention to that. You don't want to seem rude when someone's getting too close to your personal space asking you for directions, but you don't feel comfortable. There's nothing wrong, and I tell this to my wife as well, to Jennifer. I explain like this, there's nothing wrong. I shouldn't feel uncomfortable because of your actions, and I shouldn't feel bad about making myself comfortable because of something you're doing. So if you're getting too close to my personal space, I shouldn't feel uncomfortable to say, excuse me, I'm sorry, just give me a little distance. Yeah. I shouldn't feel bad about that. I'm not being rude. I don't need to be mean or rude for that purpose, but I do need to first and foremost concern myself with security and safety and not get caught up and put myself in a vulnerable position, even when I know I shouldn't, but I don't want to seem rude or impolite.
So two things that I want to close the loop on because they're phenomenal points, and I would hate to miss an opportunity because if this is the only video you watch, and again you made it this far, excellent, thank you so much. Number one, insistence implies ulterior motives. If somebody insists on something more than once or twice, they probably have designs that you aren't necessarily going to love. So they're being insistent on a sticking point with, hey, can you just do this? Can you just see this car? Can you just come see this car? Can you just come see this car? Most people are probably going to stop after one offer and its decline. So insistence implies ulterior motives.
And he did. His intention was to get her to go home with him. His intentions weren't criminal, thankfully. Right. And so it wasn't, in the end, it wasn't bad.
Right, it wasn't a criminal.
He did have an ulterior motive. He was getting her out of the bar and he was trying to segue on to a trip home.
Yeah, and insistence is a classic indicator or a cue for a disguised threat, right? And then, so the other one is an example that I love to give people because everybody, I think, is guilty of this at some point. Somebody knocks on the door at a time that they weren't expecting, middle of the day, broad daylight, and we open that door and have that conversation with that person. Well, if we don't expect that individual, there's nothing inappropriate. I mean, if you have a Ring doorbell, this kind of helps, but have that conversation through the closed door. Hey, can I help you? And if they say, I'm here with so-and-so security system or, so-and-so solar, hey, nope, sorry, not interested. And you haven't exposed yourself to the risk of opening the door to somebody you don't know and maybe not being able to close it before they're able to force their way into the home. So just recognize that good situational awareness is essential to being able to make good tactical decisions or even non-tactical decisions when it comes to like prepping and things like that.
And your door example, that's a common criminal TTP. Mm-hmm. And they'll get a cable shirt or something that looks like that. And it's oftentimes it's not just one. You got the other guys hiding around the corner, and as soon as you open that door, they rush through. I mean, that is you can look that over across the internet. You'll find plenty of examples of that.
Yeah,
as a good case in point.
Yeah. So just in summary, because I know we've talked about a lot, but we want to leave you with like the core things to focus on. Situational awareness is nothing more than your ability to accurately understand what's going on around you and develop courses of action based off of what you see that help you reach the outcome. Right.